Hi, good evening. Welcome to the International Spy Museum. My name is Vince Houghton. I'm the museum's historian and curator. And it's a topic tonight that we don't deal with all too often. And I think it's one of the more fascinating topics. It's hard to ignore when some kind of event happens around the world, whether it's a serial killer or a mass shooter or a terrorist, trying to figure out what makes this person tick. Why did they do this? And some people are soothed by answers about why did they do it, the psychoanalysis of these individuals who do these atrocious things. Do they have mommy issues? Were they bullied in school? Is it some kind of socioeconomic casualty? And this is natural, and it's far easier than trying to explain how one group of people, which essentially started out as a political party, ended up murdering 6 million innocent people. And that's not something I'm prepared to tackle. But fortunately, we have someone here tonight who has, and who is, Dr. Joel Dimsdale. I give you his CV, but we'd be here all night. He's the author of more than 500 publications and is the author of Anatomy of Malice, Psychological Examination of the Nuremberg War Criminals, or the Enigma of the Nuremberg Nazi War Criminals. He, which just came out actually relatively recently from Yale University Press. Dr. Dimsdale obtained his BA in biology from Carleton College and then his MA in sociology and his MD from Stanford. He obtained his psychiatric training at Massachusetts General Hospital and then completed a fellowship in psychobiology at the New England Regional Primate Center, which sounds, I love monkeys. It sounds like a lot of fun. With it, lots of monkeys? Yes, all right. He was on the faculty of Harvard Medical School from 1976 until 1985, and then he moved to his current position at the University of California in San Diego, where he is a distinguished professor emeritus and research professor in the Department of Psychiatry at UCSD. He has been a consultant to the President's Commission on Mental Health, the Institute of Medicine, the National Academies of Science, NASA, and the National Institutes of Health. And you're here to hear him and not me, so without further ado, Dr. Joel Dimsdale.
Thank you very much, Vince, and thank you all for coming this evening. Research tries to address enduring questions, and sometimes these questions straddle many areas of medicine, history, and our ideas of what the nature of man is. My book focuses on these issues in the context of the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg. The Nazi hierarchy embodied the essence of malice. What drove them? That's a question that captivated the world 70 years ago, and it captivates us today when we encounter malice in contemporary events. I'll discuss this question in the context of two investigators' explorations of the Nuremberg war criminals with extensive interviews and Rorschach testing. My book describes what these investigators did, what their investigations did to them, and why the data were sequestered and locked up for so many years. I've used a number of sources, interviews from family members, interviews of people who were at Nuremberg, and archival evidence locked away in the most unusual places, not just here in the obvious places like the National Archives or the Library of Congress, but in very unusual places. By the end of the war, millions of non-combatants had been murdered, and Europe was in ruins. The world was determined to understand the nature of the malice of the Nazi leaders. Peter Townsend and The Who stated the problem lyrically. What is it like to be evil? No one knows what it's like to be the bad man, to be the sad man behind blue eyes. No one knows what it's like to be hated, to be fated, to telling only lies. But my dreams, they aren't as empty as my conscience seems to be. So how could the war criminals do what they did? Were they suffering from a psychiatric disorder? Were they criminally insane, psychopaths, sadists, delusional? What do psychiatrists think? Before describing the research on the perpetrators, it's useful to review their deeds. The mass murders have a peculiar sense of familiarity because they echo our images of hell and the desolation of hell from medieval paintings. As the critic George Steiner pointed out, the concentration camps are the transference of hell from below the earth to its surface. The camps embody, often down to minutiae, the images and chronicles of hell in European art and thought, flaying, the racking, the mockery of the damned in a place of whips and hellhounds, of ovens and stinking air. Now, Steiner made one other observation that haunts this particular history. He observed that anyone who spends time studying in these dark places must be prepared for an inner resonance of great discomfort. Please recall this comment, as it will become eerily relevant to the Nuremberg investigators. There were, of course, many targets, but principally the Jews. The dots on this map are not cities, but rather locations of some of the 40,000 concentration camps in Greater Germany alone. There were slave labor camps, ghettos, concentration camps, POW camps, euthanasia centers. This was a vast industry of detainment, slave labor, and murder. There would be retribution for these crimes, and for a time the Allies couldn't agree about the process. Thus, initially, most of the war criminals were detained at the Palace Hotel, a luxury spa in Mondorf, Luxembourg, with the code name Ashcan. Security was so tight that, quote, in order to gain access, you needed a pass from God and someone to vouch for his signature. The war criminals posed for photos on the veranda of the hotel and were nicknamed the Class of 1945. Curiously, John Kenneth Galbraith was on the premises, and he sensed the drama lurking behind these walls. Quote, suppose someone had written a play and put all these characters on the stage when the curtain went up. The playbill would have read, A Jail in Luxembourg in June 1945. While the Nazis posed on the veranda at Ashcan, the Allies debated if and how and where the war crimes trial might be held. They settled on Nuremberg, a city so devastated in the war that arguably it had more bombing damage even than Dresden. The city was destroyed, but paradoxically, the courthouse and the prison survived. The war criminals were thus transferred from the Palace Hotel to the Nuremberg prison. Many people ask me how I got involved in this area. I've spent most of my professional life in this middle box, seeing patients, conducting research, running a laboratory. But something happened 40 years ago that I can't forget, and I thought I'd read a piece from the book. This was my office that I'm talking about, by the way. I was in my office in the attic of a little isolated building on the Massachusetts General Hospital grounds. There was a loud knock on my door, and I was startled because I wasn't expecting anyone, and the building had few visitors. A man walked in carrying a gun case and asked, "Are you Dimsdale?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "I'm the executioner, and I have come for you." He came into my office, sat down on my psychiatric couch, and gestured to his gun case and started to open it, and I said a little prayer to myself, wondering who I had pissed off so remarkably. But when he opened the case, I saw that it was not a gun case after all, but it was a document case, and it was filled with scrolls of World War II documents. He went on to say, "I was the Nuremberg executioner, the hangman of Nuremberg, and these documents prove that I am who I say I am." He went on to tell me that he was proud of his job, and that while still being professional about it, he enjoyed hanging the criminals. They were scum, Dimsdale, and you need to be studying them and not the survivors. This was a topic that was much too dark, and I shelved it for many years, but it gnawed away at me. And besides, how could I study people who had died so many years before? And then I discovered the power of archives. The archives are like an antiques roadhouse. They're frequently not really curated, so not even the librarians know what they have. They have a box that says something like Nuremberg, 1946, but no inclination of what's in there. So I've studied in many places. One of my first ventures was here in the Library of Congress when I was looking at Justice Robert Jackson's papers. He was the lead American prosecutor at the trial. And I saw this telegram popped out, and it was from Harvard criminologist Sheldon Gluck. And it was an unusual telegram urging the appointment of psychiatrists, psychologists, anthropologists to study the war criminals. In fact, Gluck suggested that a thorough pretrial examination be made of the war criminals, and many professional societies in psychiatry and neurology joined in on this effort. Today, there'd be no way all of these societies would agree about anything other than requests for more funding from NIH. But then there was unanimity and rapid-fire correspondence going back and forth from the societies to the prosecutor's office to the OSS. They suggested three things: study the war criminals, give them Rorschachs, and then save their brains after they were executed. The assumption then was that they might be shot in the head, but these societies wanted the brain. There were many letters in the files, all on these topics. I'm going to focus on these 3 points about how the war criminals should be studied, whether with the Rorschach, and what the brains did or did not establish. But in a way, this begins long before. It begins with this man, a kind of a Brad Pitt look-alike, Hermann Rorschach, who was a remarkably gifted psychiatrist who died young. His famous Rorschach Test, he was only able to get that published 1 year before he died. How many have in the audience have ever taken a Rorschach test? It's not done very much anymore, and there's a kind of a musty, dated quality about the test and a mysterious quality about the test. We'll go into that. We get most of our ideas about Rorschachs from old movies. So when he died in 1922, Rorschach had no idea that another world war was looming that brought with it new levels of depravity and barbarity, or any idea at all that people would turn to his test for answers. Now, when one takes a Rorschach test, the investigator basically asks two questions. What might this be? And what made you say that? What part of the blot are you attending to when you say that? It's a very powerful test, and the investigator looks not just at the content, but also where you're looking. Are you responding to the color of the blot or the shading of the blot? Are you responding to details or the gestalt? But there have always been concerns about the ink blot test in that you could read into it. And if you go back to Shakespeare in Hamlet, this is all anticipated. Hamlet and Polonius are talking. Hamlet's looking at the cloud in the sky and says, "Do you see yonder cloud that's almost in shape of a camel?" Polonius, "By the mass, and 'tis like a camel indeed." Hamlet, "Methinks it's a weasel." Polonius, it is packed like a weasel." Hamlet, "No, it's more like a whale." Polonius, "Very like a whale." So this problem of what one sees in the Rorschach is greatly shaped by what your expectations are when you're viewing the blot itself. So the assumption is that all of these defendants were depraved monsters, psychopaths. But what does that mean, and how do you prove it? In reality, these were a very heterogeneous group of high-ranking defendants. Hess was occasionally delusional and frequently claimed amnesia. Streicher's pornographic racist theories were so objectionable that the Nazis themselves had locked him up in house arrest for the last 3 years of the war. In fact, many of them absolutely loathed each other. Psychiatrist Douglas Kelley and psychologist Gustav Gilbert were minor functionaries at Nuremberg, but are our major protagonists concerning the Rorschach testing. They had multiple roles, traditional roles that a psychiatrist has everywhere in prison, to determine fitness for trial, to maintain prisoners' morale. In the context of the war crimes trial, they also were advisors to the prosecution. But they had their personal goals, very audacious goals, to investigate the psychopathology of the Nazi leaders and to pursue their own ambitions. I'll focus this evening on their interactions with 4 of the defendants, Hess, Goering, Ley, and Streicher. It is important to recall that the circumstances in the jail, the prisoners were held in small, solitary cells, and there were enormous pressures on everyone. Many of the diaries and autobiographies of people who were at Nuremberg, from the MPs to the translators to the janitors to the lawyers, they all speak of the pressure cooker atmosphere of that trial, which went on for practically a year. And there were enormous concerns about suicide in the jail. As well there should be. These were very dark times. Cyanide was everywhere. These are data that I pulled just from Berlin in 1945, and it shows the suicide rate and the anticipation of the Russians arriving in Berlin in April. So you can see that under these enormous pressures of war, suicide is greatly increased. Robert Ley suppressed the labor unions, committed numerous war crimes himself. He had a history of multiple head injuries and episodes of unconsciousness. He was a plane crash survivor that left him with a partial aphasia, a severe stammer, and he was an alcoholic. Psychiatrist Douglas Kelley evaluated Ley in October 1945 and said normal psychomotor reactions and normal attitudes and behavior. Mood is normal, but affect is extremely labile. The Rorschach examination reveals emotional instability and evidence of frontal lobe damage. He is one of the most potentially suicidal prisoners due to his extreme instability secondary to his old head injury. Ley is competent. Ley hanged himself the next day, and Kelley wrote sardonically in 1946, "Since Ley kindly made his brain available for post-mortem examination, we were presented with a rare chance to verify our clinical and research findings." There was a great deal of popular interest in the idea of finding the lesion in the war criminal's brain. The race was on to prove that these were brain-damaged, Frankenstein-like monsters. The Sarasota Herald-Tribune quoted the Surgeon General of the Army as saying, "The brain-proved changes were sufficient to account for the unusual behavior of Ley." Not to be outdone, Life magazine ran a story showing Major Webb Haymaker of the U.S. Army Institute of Pathology here dissecting Ley's brain. Haymaker reported long-standing degenerative processes of the frontal lobe consistent with chronic encephalopathy. I'd like to move on to discuss Hermann Goering and his interactions with Kelley and Gilbert. Goering arrived at Ashcan with 49 suitcases and loads of jewelry, notably large rings, and with all of Germany's paracodeine supply. Kelley spent a considerable amount of time with Goering, and one starts to get a glimpse of Kelley as an astute, pragmatic clinician. Goering started complaining of withdrawal symptoms from the opiates. Kelley writes, "Goering was very proud. I suggested to him that while weaker men, like Ribbentrop, whom he loathed, would perhaps require doses of medicines should they ever be withdrawn from a drug habit, he, Goering, being strong and forceful, would require nothing." Goering agreed and cooperated wholeheartedly. Goering weighed 280 pounds on capture. Kelley was worried about his heart and appealed to Goering's narcissism. When I pointed out that he would make a better appearance in court should he lose some weight, he agreed and lost 60 pounds in 5 months. Julius Streicher was editor of the pornographic anti-Semitic newspaper. He was a kind of a Hannibal Lecter with a typewriter. He urged his followers to beat up his political opponents and even accused his competitors within the Nazi Party of sexual inadequacy. Whereas Goering could be affable if he chose to be, no one found Streicher affable. Indeed, he was so loathsome that even the Nazis put him under house arrest. Rudolf Hess was one of the other major defendants. He complained of amnesia and numerous somatic ailments. He was intermittently suspicious and saved samples of his food to prove he was being poisoned. Seen here is a photo of one of his envelopes with red sealing wax. He was convinced that the crackers in prison contained brain poison and sealed up samples which he surrendered upon arrival to Nuremberg and asked for the Swiss embassy to assay, and they reported that indeed the envelopes contained crackers. This envelope I located right here in Silver Spring, Maryland. Gilbert and Kelley describe Hess as rather similar, emotionally withdrawn, shy, withdrawn, and suspicious. But let's meet the people who tested the Nazi leaders so extensively. Psychiatrist Douglas Kelley was one of Terman's California geniuses, the top 0.5% of IQ in the state of California. He was a Columbia graduate, an expert in forensic psychiatry, personality, and the Rorschach. Kelley's relationship with Goering was intense and close. Kelley wrote, "Goering is one of the easiest to get along with. Each day when I came to his cell, he would jump up from his chair, greet me with a broad smile and outstretched hand, escort me to his cot, and pat its middle with his great paw. 'Good morning, doctor. I'm so glad you've come to see me. Please sit down, doctor. Sit here.' Then he would ease his own great body down beside me, ready to answer my questions. Goering was charming when he chose to be charming. He had excellent intelligence, keen imagination, great drive, and sense of humor. Kelley spent hours with Goering, discussing politics, the war, the trial, testing him. Goering, in turn, regarded Kelley as a well-connected fixer. Kelley agreed to intercede with Wild Bill Donovan on Goering's behalf and to personally deliver letters to Goering's wife. Goering writes his wife, "Today I can send you a letter direct. Major Kelley, the doctor who is treating me and who has my fullest confidence, is bringing it to you. You can also talk to him freely." Goering offers Kelley one of his enormous rings in thanks. Kelley refuses, and then Goering responds, "Then I'll give you something even better and more valuable, a signed photograph of me." By enormous good fortune, Kelley was a world expert in Rorschach, but he didn't speak German. Gustav Gilbert, on the far right, was an American psychologist of an Austrian Jewish family. In Gilbert's writings, one senses more feelings of hatred for the Nazis. Kelley was just trying to get them to trial and was intellectually curious about them, regarding them as specimens. However, Gilbert loathed them and urgently wanted to understand their pathology. His German was impeccable, but he had little expertise with the Rorschach. So there you have it, what I would call a collaboration from hell. Two brilliant men who had complementary skills. They needed each other, they were very different, and they were very competitive with each other. Kelley designed the testing protocol. It was never used in evidence in the trial. And the criminals actually enjoyed completing it. They compared their IQ scores like kids today comparing SAT tests. After the war, Kelley assumed editorial positions and became a professor of criminology at Berkeley. He concluded in his famous quote, "Nazism is a sociocultural disease. I had at Nuremberg the purest known Nazi virus cultures, 22 flasks, as it were, to study." Well, let's practice. It's the end of the day. What do you see here? Take a moment and think about it. Think to yourself, what do you see in this ink blot? And then ask yourself, what made you say that? Now recall that there are 10 cards, and typically people have multiple responses to each card. And it's a very challenging test to keep track of. So, Hans Frisch of the propaganda ministry says, 2 dancing bears, very clear, or gnomes, or dwarfs. It makes a revolting impression, not at all friendly. The bloody color makes me feel uncomfortable. Robert Ley says, a butterfly. There are colors here, black and red and white. He keeps perseverating, black and red and white. A stork or goose would be better. It looks like it was tipped over with its legs pulled in, jaws of the butterfly. Hermann Goering laughs and says, those are 2 dancing figures, very clear. Shoulder here and face there. He claps his hands and he cuts off the bottom part of the figure with his hand. And he says, the top red is the head and the hat. The face is partly white. Rudolf Hess says, parts of an insect with blood spots, mask of an island savage. The opening is for the mouth. It is devilish, and that is why the eyes and beard are red. So Kelley and Gilbert's first 2 conclusions were very similar. They regarded them, the Rorschachs and all of the defendants that they tested, as sane and aggressive individuals, but their bottom conclusions are fundamentally different. Kelley said that they were basically ordinary people influenced by mendacity and bureaucracy, creatures of their environment. People could be found behind big desks anywhere. Gilbert, on the other hand, said these were narcissistic psychopaths. But there were peculiar things going on in the prison. For instance, when Kelley left, Goering wept, and he asked Kelley to adopt his daughter Etta if his wife died in the war. Meanwhile, the competition between Kelley and Gilbert just smoldered, getting hotter and hotter. And again, I would suggest recalling this quote from Steiner, that anyone who spends time studying in these dark places has to be prepared for an inner resonance of great discomfort. Kelley and Gilbert raced to publication, but they actually didn't publish their Rorschachs. No one would touch it. To a certain extent, the field was aware of the toxic conflict between Gilbert and Kelley, and also there was an odd sense of unease. When people started looking at the Rorschachs, they didn't see quite what they were expecting to see. Molly Harrower was one of the world's foremost Rorschach expert, and she was a friend to both Kelley and Gilbert. She tried constantly to persuade them to compromise with each other. She tried to get colleagues to view the documents. She invited colleagues to a conference in London, shipped the Rorschachs, and imagine if the world's greatest Rorschach expert picked you as one of the 10 people to review the most challenging, important Rorschachs ever obtained. Everyone declined. Everyone declined. Everyone took a look at the Rorschachs and claimed that they were too busy. So, again, they didn't want to get involved. Molly, meanwhile, was approaching Gustav Gilbert and negotiating to publish some of his Rorschach findings, and Gilbert got impatient with the editorial review. I don't know how many of you are academics, but it takes a long time, a lot of back and forth. And he then did something which he came to regret. He simultaneously submitted the same manuscript to another journal, and as luck would have it, the new publisher selected Molly Harrower as the blind, impartial, independent reviewer. Gilbert's Rorschachs finally were released in 1975, and we'll come back to that. I'm afraid I have some very sorry news about Dr. Kelley. On New Year's Day in 1958, he committed suicide in front of his family. He was cooking a New Year's dinner, got in a quarrel with his wife, went to his study, came out and said, "I think I've killed myself," and died a minute later. His son explained in a recent interview, "I think maybe he knew he was on a runaway train. I think he knew what was inside, but he didn't know how to make it go away." Kelley's study was filled with chemicals, medications, and Nazi memorabilia. He died with cyanide, and regardless of why or what his motives were, there were wild speculations about where he got the cyanide. People were obsessed with the question about where the poison came from. So Miali and Seltzer published Gilbert's Rorschachs in 1975, and according to them, the Rorschachs showed that they were a homogeneous group of warped psychopaths who were distinctly savage and devilish. But Molly Harrower said, how can this be? They may have been very corrupt, malicious people, but no one could ever call them homogeneous, given how different they were in their persona and behaviors. And then she went on to say, wonder whether what the Rorschachs would show of cabinet ministers. These were not the Nuremberg, the original Nuremberg criminals were cabinet ministers. They weren't the people who shot or killed the prisoners. So she decided to conduct an ingenious experiment. She, because of her expertise with the Rorschach, she had hordes of Rorschachs from all sorts of people. So she took three groups of Rorschachs: the Nuremberg war criminals, Unitarian ministers, and psychiatric outpatients. And she snipped off the top of each Rorschach, so the names were not available. And she shuffled the deck and sent them to Rorschach experts and said, well, can you find any common features in one set versus another? Do you find there are some unique features? And when the Rorschach experts confronted these blindly, they could not discern any common characteristics in the war criminals. So what are the intellectual traditions in trying to understand malice? There are multiple intellectual strands, and Kelley and Gilbert correspond to two of the strongest and most familiar strands. Gilbert clearly believed in psychopathology. Psychopaths were described as violent, manipulative, impulsive, callous, lacking empathy or remorse. Curiously, there's always been a suspicion that there was something wrong with the brains of the psychopaths. They don't learn well from their life's experience, which is fortunate for the rest of us. They don't respond to stressors with a typical stress response, and some of them do, in fact, have some brain abnormalities. Remember Robert Ley's brain, for instance. There are contemporary studies, and one asks, is it a bad person or is it a bad brain? There are a number of neuroimaging studies today which are contrasting violent psychopaths with various comparison groups. I just picked one randomly, a recent study, which purports to show that the MRI shows thinning of the cortex of psychopaths. Well, if Gilbert believed in psychopathology, Kelley was swayed by a social psychological perspective that we're all capable of evil under certain circumstances. And this was certainly shown by a number of prominent social psychological studies that we're all familiar with. In Hannah Arendt's work, she described evil not just as banal, but kind of a quote that tends to be forgotten. She described the Nazi evil as like a fungus that spreads. The Yale shock experiment by Stanley Milgram certainly demonstrated that people would obey authority, do terrible things. When Kitty Genovese was murdered, it stirred up Darley and Lataday's work to study how people would stand by and watch things happen and do nothing. And then, of course, the Stanford Prison Experiment by Zimbardo, where people would adopt sadistic behaviors when placed in certain roles. Well, I've discussed the two most prominent scholarly traditions, but there are other traditions to account for and explain malice, and they need to be kept in mind. A third perspective is a legal perspective, a forensic perspective, and that is that people make mistakes and make restitution. Indeed, there are variations from state to state as to how existing psychiatric disorders influence judgment and sentencing. Although psychiatrists and courts may use words like psychiatric disorder and insanity, they may use similar words, but the nuances and the surrounds are vastly different in those realms. And the fourth perspective is a religious perspective that's embodied very commonly. In Paul writes, "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places." And I think the fifth perspective is the darkest of all. When I graduated from college, I still remember our commencement speaker giving this quote, which this was, what a quote to send people off into the world. The Greek philosopher Bias, who concluded, "Most men are bad." So, what's the burden of proof? If you were working in this area with a sample size of 21, would you find this convincing? It was a heterogeneous sample, men who were in solitary confinement for a year awaiting a death sentence. Is this the right context to really try to get an understanding? Were these even the right Nazis to test? Should one have tested the concentration camp guards? Would one infer differences with that kind of testing? And was the Rorschach even administered properly? In the the quote of Kelley. Remember, Goering is sandwiched between Gilbert and Kelley on a sagging little cot in a smelly 100-square-foot room. Is this the optimal technique for doing a Rorschach? So, all that said, this is the best and only information we have about war criminals since Nuremberg, in all of the subsequent trials, in the contemporary war crimes trials in The Hague. There is no Douglas Kelley, there is no Gustav Gilbert, there's no one there trying to do the research. There are psychiatrists there, and they confine their task to the narrower question of ability to stand trial. So there's something very special about these data, and I believe they do have something to tell us. I'm going to conclude. I read a little piece from the foreword. I thought I'd read the afterword from my book. I was on another improbable quest for answers. What is it about this topic that leads to archives in such improbable places? This time, I was back home in California, walking through the redwood trees that stand like sentinels around the library at UC Santa Cruz. A subdued light filtered through the moist early morning air, and the groves were filled with the scent of the redwoods and the caws from the Steller's jays. I had come to the library in the hopes of learning more about Malice. For unclear reasons, its archives held some of Douglas Kelley's papers. The files were useful in revealing more information about Kelley, magician, astronomer, television producer, raconteur, but included few new documents pertinent to Nuremberg. I was, of course, disappointed. But then I started to reflect, would any archives have answered my question about Malice? The Bible says pointedly, the dark places of the earth are full of the habitations of cruelty. The poet Pablo Neruda concludes more hopefully, the earth is a bed blooming for love, soiled in blood. Kelley found some darkness in every person. Gilbert found a unique darkness in some. I believe they were both right. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dimsdale. Am I on? Sorry, can you turn me up? All right, that's better. So we're going to open up for questions and answers. So I want to, as our host here tonight, I'm going to take the right of the first question. And you kind of alluded a little bit to what I was going to ask. As academics, we like to have our own information. We like to take our own primary sources and understand them. I guess as a psychiatrist, you probably want to make conclusions based on your own observations. In this case, you're obviously using other people's observations. You even refer to the fact, were these tests done in the exact way that you would have done them? How different do you have to approach it? Obviously, all these people are dead. So how different do you have to approach this? Because you're looking at other people's data. You're looking at other people's methods. Did you have to evaluate their methodology before you even got started? I mean, how differently did you approach this? Because you weren't the one actually doing the direct analysis, asking the questions, doing these tests. You're kind of piggybacking on other people's information.
Good question. Let me tease that into two parts. How does one try to make sense of data secondhand? And another part, which I think you were implying, what would I do differently?
I'll straight out say it. What would you have done differently?
Thank you. I think, it's an interesting thing. Obviously, I can't interview the dead. There are some of the protocols are available. The IQ tests are, no one has criticized the IQ tests. They were standard IQ tests, and they showed a range from very gifted to dull normal. Julius Streicher, for instance, could barely make change in a mental arithmetic challenge. On the other hand, some of the others were very bright. Actually, Douglas Kelley commented that he was interviewed in the New Yorker in 1949 or 1950, and he said, yes, Goering was bright, but he was no genius. And of course, Kelley was a genius because he was a bona fide genius certified by Terman. So I think the IQ tests are pretty irrefutable. Other than that, I think the challenge of history is sifting through the past. And you can't expect a uniformity of views, and you kind of triangulate. There's a cacophony of viewpoints, which I encountered. And it's just you go to the archives, and it's quarrelsome down there. It's so noisy with people disputing, maybe not actively face-to-face, but offering different opinions. So I think one tries one's best as one can to look for a theme. Now the second question, what would I do differently today? Well, there are a couple things. Psychiatry has changed enormously. I mean, we're not even sure about the words anymore. There's a shifting of words, and that's true for all of medicine. I mean, psychiatry is singularly vulnerable to this. But even cardiology, such as it was in 1945, was a little iffy. Goering, for instance, was reported to have sustained many heart attacks in prison. But that word doesn't mean the same as it does today. EKGs were hard to come by in prison in 1945. There were no serum enzymes that many of you are familiar with. And indeed, heart attack then could mean anything from a palpitation to a sudden death. And so even when you read medical charts, it's a little difficult to sort through. And psychiatry, it's the same thing. If they use a term like schizophrenia, did they mean something different from what I would say today? One of psychiatry's big changes came about with the DSM, or the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. And psychiatry periodically updates this every 10 or 20 years to use the best evidence for what we think coheres as we describe diagnoses and what has emerged in the research. So for the last 25 years, we've been much more precise about documenting exactly what we're seeing in an interview, as opposed to just skipping to the bottom and stamping a diagnosis on someone. The other area is new. It's not ready for prime time, but I'm going to mention it anyway. Please remember, I said it's not ready for prime time, and feel free to shout at me, but I'll remind you about that. And it has to do with an emerging field of neurolaw. This question about, is it a bad man or a bad brain? And predictably, you know absolutely that even today, the neural defense is being offered very commonly, with variable success from the defendant's point of view. But I think that one would definitely want to be doing careful neural imaging. There are studies, for instance, where I showed one study that looked at structural changes in a group of psychopaths. You can also look at functional studies. So if I show you a picture of me falling off the platform, most of us would wince at looking at that. Well, it turns out, as I mentioned, the psychopaths don't have much empathy. And when psychopaths are confronted with a scene like that, or when people smash their hand in a car door, they don't have a visceral response, a psychophysiological response. They're pithed. They're just disembodied from a response. And curiously, their brains don't light up either in response to that empathy-producing stimulus. So I think one can predict that people will be using such probes in the future. There was a study published in Science maybe 5 years ago. Some of you may remember it. You know, we all go to conventions, and judges go to conventions as well. And I think the meeting was in Vegas. And they gave judges 2 vignettes and asked them how they would sentence people. And both vignettes were for a crime of violence, robbing a liquor store or something like that. And they presented a history, and the vignettes were exactly the same. But one of the vignettes had an extra paragraph that a defense psychiatrist had produced evidence, arguably, that the defendant's brain had some deficits in processing. So the question is, did that extra information potentially influence the judges one way or the other? What do you think? How many thought the judges would vote the same regardless? Okay. How many thought the judges would massively cut the sentence for the... Well, I have comfort for everyone here. The judges did cut the sentence, but only by a month. So they did take it into consideration. I think that's important. The question of volition, intent, it may well mitigate a sentence, but the person is still held responsible. The other, I'm sorry, I'm going a little long-winded, but the other approach that may start to take off is studies of oxytocin, which is one of the hormones elaborated in the brain, and oddly enough, there's evidence that when people have empathy, they have more of an oxytocin response. And some people have tried experimenting some studies with oxytocin and psychopaths. It's very much up in the air. But I think things will evolve if we have the will to study it. And, you know, in the international sense of war criminals, I'm not sure whether we would, but other questions?
So, laughing at somebody falling off a stage doesn't make me a psychopath. Sorry. So we are going to open up.
I mean, Lucille Ball could fall off a stage, but she was such an athlete that she wouldn't get hurt. I would probably break a leg.
So we do want to open up to the audience. Please wait. Amanda and Laura over there are going to have microphones, so when they come over to you, yes, ma'am.
Oh, thank you very much for this great presentation. You said that Kelley, that Goering was a big admirer of Kelley. He was always glad to see him.
They both liked each other a lot.
But you said Kelley didn't speak German.
Right.
Goering speak English?
Well, first off, Goering did speak English,
okay.
But Kelley had a translator with him when he spoke with the prisoners, And some of the prisoners spoke impeccable English. This is I think one of the most challenging, disheartening things about Nazi Germany was that at the pinnacle of the leadership, we're not talking about uneducated people who were just kindled by rabble-rousing politicians. Many of these people were very educated, had PhDs in literature, in chemistry, in political science. Rudolf Hess, the deputy Führer, his English was superb. He had spent 4 years in a British psychiatric hospital. So his English was pretty darn good after that. It would be another long evening to go into that, and I'm sorry, but if you want to read more about Hess, I discuss him extensively.
Laura, going to the back right there.
Thank you. What I want to say is, are you familiar with Professor Fallon, James Fallon?
Yes.
Well, you know, he went to have his brain examined because his mother informed him that there had been some very bad characters in their family line. And when he was given this examination, it was found out that his brain showed all the signs of a psychopath, but he had never committed any crime. And he wanted to know, well, if I have this in my brain, how come I haven't done things? And they believed that it was due to him and his social environment, that he was in a good environment that didn't make him want to go bad. So I have this feeling that I believe that a little bit of it has to do with the brain and also the genes. I read Dr. Robert Hare's book. You're familiar with him on psychopathy. Are you, sir?
Yeah.
All right. And there was another Dr. Keel who has this machine that book where he did the forensic MRIs on people.
I'm not familiar with Dr. Keel, but
Yeah, I don't know if I'm pronouncing the name correctly, but
sure.
I have come to the conclusion that I believe it's a little bit of both. This is only a layman's opinion. I'm no professional, you know. But I have noticed that there's in certain families, you can have 3 children. 2 will do very well, but there's one that's always a problem. And I always wonder, why is that? They have the same advantage, all 3 of them, but 2 come out great and 1 comes out bad. And I'm going to conclude on this. Dr. Kelley, when he did Hermann Goering's, the Rorschach Test, I looked at one of the pictures that he asked Goering to look upon. And I saw the same thing Goering did. And I went around, and to my friends, they never saw it. So I wondered, why not? I'm looking right at it. He claimed he saw a man with a big belly, a cigar in his mouth, and a hat on his head. When I looked at that picture, I saw that same thing. And I don't know what it implies about me, you know, but I have a feeling that it's a little bit of both, in my opinion. I think it's the brain, and sometimes it's the gene. That's the only thing I can think of. I'm not a professional, never went to school. So, but it has always interested me, this type of thing. That's why I'm here tonight, and I try to read all these books, because I wonder, why do we do what we do? You know, I grew up in a very bad neighborhood, but I never got into any trouble.
Sir, do you have a question? I mean, you are really interesting, but do you have a question?
I'm sorry. I'm sorry,
do you have
but
a question
you
for
know,
the
do you feel it's a little bit of both? Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
So
Very interesting.
let me try to distill that into a couple shorter take questions. You're talking about the complexity of behavior and sorting it out, and how do you understand it? You know, we all struggle with that, and we all struggle. We see families. Actually, Goering had a younger brother And the younger brother was repeatedly arrested by the SS because the younger brother was helping Jews. And Goering was furious with his younger brother because he had to kind of keep bailing his brother out, and he was giving Hermann a black eye, so to speak, in the Nazi Party. And at one point, the younger brother said, "Hermann, I've been reading and hearing rumors of terrible things going on in the East. Is it true?" And Hermann replied, "Oh, don't believe any of that propaganda. You're not a politician. You were always the black sheep of the family." Yes, we are different in our families. The mystery of how much is encoded in our genes and encoded by early life events, I'm sure it's a mixture of all of those things. Now the second, as to the cigar and the big belly and the Rorschach. So I showed you, and maybe many of you saw certain images the same way that various of the Nazis did. Please remember that if you are really a Rorschach tester, you're making very little of emphasis on what you're saying. Rudolf Hess saying he saw bloody insect spots or something like that. Instead, the Rorschach investigator is looking to see, are you responding to color or to shade? Are you responding to body parts or not? And the investigator is looking at that on multiple cards. So the fact that if any of you saw the same things in the one card, that's one card, one snippet of data. Also, it comes back to the question of, do you believe the Rorschach is a valid instrument or not? And I think my take on it is that it's a very sensitive instrument. I'm an amateur photographer, and I think looking at a Rorschach is like taking a telephoto photograph without a tripod. There's a lot of jiggle to it, and you have to be very careful with it. Another question.
Yeah, thank you. So you've got the executive branch, basically.
Yep.
These 21 guys, minus Hitler, minus Himmler, who
And Goebbels.
and Goebbels. Has anybody looked into the backgrounds of the lesser ones? You refer to the concentration camp guards. I'm interested in the SS officers that would order the shooting of prisoners outright, or the whole destruction of a village, as was done at one village in France, because a couple of SS officers had been killed. 600 people were just killed. Somebody had to give this order. When these people were interrogated later or brought to trial or whatever, did they get the same psychological workups as the executives did?
That's an astute question. As I meant to say, there were many war crimes trials. The International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, the first one, tried the highest ranking Nazis they could find. There were subsequent trials, trials of the doctors, trials of the lawyers, all similarly high rank but not the highest rank. And then there have, but Kelley and Gilbert were gone. They were not studied that way. There have been some studies. There's a study of, I think, Danish collaborators, and they looked at that it's a appreciable sample size of roughly 500 souls. And there were some equivocal findings, which I mean, there were some subtle things, but I'm not sure I had a very strong response to it one way or another of understanding what was encountered. I wanted to study the cabinet ministers, the people who were least able to argue that I was just a cog in the wheel of state. If there was a group of people that had intentionality, will, power, this was the group to study. So I was interested in the predation people as opposed to the real hands-on murderers.
It seems to me from the way you describe Gilbert and Goering's interactions, I mean, one interpretation might be that Goering was trying to ingratiate himself to Gilbert so that he could perhaps get better treatment. I mean, he got a letter to his wife. I mean, and maybe he thought he could get a lesser sentence. I mean, he was trying to ingratiate himself. That's what it seems like to me.
So first of all, it was Kelley.
Kelley, okay.
I just want to.
Yeah.
So absolutely. Goering was capable of being a very charming man, and everybody knew it, and Kelley knew it. Kelley spent a lot of time with Goering, yes, he delivered a letter to Goering's wife, but he called Goering pretty straight in his analysis. Kelley claimed to have spent 80 hours interviewing Goering. Now that, whether he amplified that a bit, I don't know, but he spent a lot of time with him. So was Goering trying to get a lighter sentence? Goering knew he would be executed. He knew he would be executed, and the only thing he was trying for was to be shot as opposed to hanged. That was the only thing that Goering was after. He was in negotiations with the OSS. They was in all sorts of negotiations to try to let him have a decent execution from a military point of view. He found the idea of hanging humiliating. So I don't think he was trying to get off from his relationship with Kelley.
Were they going to hang him, and that's why he committed suicide?
Yes, he was sentenced to hang and killed himself with cyanide 1 hour before he was hung. And this is one of those mysteries that will never be solved. Oddly, there's this wild competition. I gave Goering the side. No, I did. So there are 4 people who have argued that they gave Goering the cyanide. The fact is, he killed himself with cyanide an hour before he was to be hung. And Goering's, I mentioned that Robert Ley had strangled himself as well. Their suicides were very different. Goering's was done out of defiance, whereas Ley's was done by remorse. And the paradox of this, so here we have Robert Ley, the one war criminal whose brain we have and who we know had substantial brain injury, and yet he was the one war criminal who had substantial remorse.
Hello. You mentioned that Gilbert loathed the Nazis, correct?
Yeah.
I was just curious if you thought that had any effect on his research or the findings that he had compared to Kelley, who seemed to form more relationships with them.
They had a different style of interacting with the prisoners, and Gilbert had a more formal interaction with them, and some, like Hess, actually I think got along better. I'm inferring this with Gilbert than with Kelley. I have a quote in the book. Gilbert kept a diary, a very interesting diary, called the Nuremberg Diary. He describes interviews with Streicher, and how Streicher was so obsessed with pornography and race defilement and anti-Semitism, and Gilbert commented, I think quite candidly, that 15 minutes with Streicher was about as much as he could tolerate, and I share that point of view. I think if I were to interview Julius Streicher today, I'd probably go home and take a shower with Fisohex.
A more mundane question. We know that Kelley obviously admired Goering and so forth and so on. And then how do we know how he reacted to Goering's suicide? And could there possibly be any connection with the way that Kelley chose to end his life with the same capsule, maybe came from Goering? Who knows?
Well, that's what everyone noticed, that these two men who were quite close, and they both killed themselves with the same tool. But we can't possibly discern where Kelley got the cyanide. Cyanide was everywhere. The last performance of the German Philharmonic before the Russians liberated Berlin, the Hitler Youth came through the orchestra handing out cyanide capsules for people to take so they wouldn't have to face the Russians. So cyanide was everywhere at the time, and culturally, as I showed you, just from Berlin, the suicide was very high at that point.
Did he write about suicide? Did he say, "Oh my God, what is this man doing?" Or did he admire him for suicide?
So the question was, did Kelley admire Goering for his suicide? I don't think he admired Goering for that. Kelley wrote that, and this is not it's not a full quote, but it was so typical for Goering to go out that way, and that it was a defiant a stance that humiliated the Allies. Of course, Goering was the number one person that the Allies wished to hang. But I don't think I would say that Kelley admired him. I've not seen anything in the stuff that I've looked at.
Hi, that's a fascinating presentation. I was interested in the way you approached the topic, and that you, instead, as a psychiatrist, you didn't put these people on the couch yourself, like Lifton for the Nazi doctors. He had all these people, and he interviewed some, but he came to his own conclusions about doubling, and that's how they handled, killing people. So I wondered why you didn't just put them on the couch yourself, using Gilbert's and Kelley's material and then adding your own biographical stuff. I mean, this is a great story, and it's fascinating to hear their interactions, but why did you approach it that way?
Ooh. That is, I think, one of the toughest questions anybody's asked me, and they were tough questions, but I didn't rush into writing this. As I said, this was 45 years ago that the executioner came to me, and I continued reading a little bit and thinking, and ultimately I was struck by Galbraith's quote about imagining this as a play, with the curtain going up and a mansion in Luxembourg, in Mondorf, Luxembourg. And I found it very interesting to look on the one hand at 4 of the war criminals. I just picked 4 because they were, would be a very long book if I picked all 21, but also because each of them was distinctly different, and I wanted to try to hone in on that. And I then focused on the other side, the people, Kelley and Gilbert, and I didn't talk this evening about the warden of the jail, who's a very interesting man, nor did I talk about Robert Jackson very much, the justice. It seemed to me that each of these were characters that just seemed to ask to be written in a certain way. I'm sorry if that sounds mystical, but that's just the way I felt I should write it.
You said you found a card in Silver Spring. Now, I've lived there for 71 years. Where did you find that card in Silver Spring?
A relative of one of the major people I've talked about.
So we're going to wrap this up so that you have opportunity to go sign some books and talk to me. Let me ask one final question. There actually was a high-level Nazi war criminal that was captured long after this,
Sure.
Adolf Eichmann.
Yep.
Did anyone psychoanalyze him? Did it kind of apply these same things now that psychiatry had moved forward a little bit? People knew a little bit more about things.
So, interestingly, Gustav Gilbert was called back to Jerusalem to testify in Eichmann's trial. Not that Gilbert had any interactions, or not that he had done any testing of Eichmann, but just because somebody had told Gilbert in the war what Eichmann was doing. So it was more data about Eichmann. Eichmann was subjected to psychologic testing, and Gilbert tried to talk about it, and the judge cut him off and said, "That's irrelevant. We just want to know what you knew about what Eichmann did." And Gilbert was chagrined, but that's would take us very far.
Well, please join me in thanking Dr. Joel Dimsdale for talking to us tonight. And he will be in the back if you want books signed and sort of chat with all of you. Thank you.